This is Jeff Deist, and you're listening to the Human Action Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Deist, and I have been looking forward to this show. We're going to do several shows, actually, on Rothbard's famous treatise, An Austrian Perspective on the History of Economic Thought. This is a voluminous 2 volumes, to put it mildly. Just volume 1 alone is over 500 pages. And last week we had our great friend and Mises Institute fellow, Dr. Patrick Newman, who is not only an economic historian, but also a professor of economics at Florida Southern, join us to sort of whet your appetite for this book and discuss some of the background behind it. But today, Patrick joins us again to get into the meat of volume 1 of this. So all that said, Patrick, it's great to hear your voice.
It's great to be on again. I'm really excited to talk about Rothbard's book.
Yes, and of course, this is an actual area of specialization for you on the history of thought. And this morning I was talking to Joe Becker, who runs our graduate program here at the Institute. He was a master's student of Rothbard at UNLV, and we were talking about how if you look at the table of contents to these 2 volumes, it really mirrors somewhat his syllabus at UNLV. So we can see in the early 90s, as Rothbard was teaching this class on history at UNLV, he was had developed, I think, in his mind, the genesis of this book.
Oh, absolutely. As someone who I've spoken with Joe Becker about this. I've also looked at several of Rothbard's syllabi for history of thought, which he taught at UNLV. He taught up the class right up until his untimely death in early 1995. And looking at the tests, so not only the syllabus, but also the tests, it's very clear that he was teaching what he was writing about. So this was a higher level elective for students, and he was going through the material that he was writing and he wanted to talk to his students about. So it's quite interesting seeing Rothbard teach the information that he was researching to his students. Well,
he spends many hundreds of pages in Volume 1 going through pre-Adam Smith thought. So I think that in and of itself makes this book stand apart from other books of the genre. But also, Patrick, he seems to not be able to help himself. I mean, Rothbard always comes through, sometimes acerbic, sometimes very opinionated, and thoroughly Austrian. Do you think his personal views and biases color this book too much, or do you think that that's what makes it fun to read and not boring?
Well, Rothbard certainly never pulled punches. He with all of his historical work and even his theoretical work, he's got good guys, he's got bad guys. So in this book, he goes for the jugular for people he does not, people whose economic thought, as well as political thought, etc., that he disagrees with, and he also lavishes praise on those he agrees with. So that's something that's been very controversial regarding this 2-volume work. It's that some people say Rothbard's unfair with certain people, and he's overly praiseworthy of others. That is something that does affect the book, but I think that's what makes it unique. And that's you really don't get that in other works, because something Rothbard was always. He did not want people to think that he was sort of unbiased. He was always, I'm coming at from an Austrian perspective, a libertarian perspective, as opposed to the sort of quote unquote value-free perspective of traditional economists, historians, et cetera. But it's always really just secretly in favor of government intervention and so on. So Rothbard, he always threw all of his cards on the table. You knew where he was coming from. And he also wants to slaughter some sacred cows. And this could be uncomfortable for a lot of people, but that's just Rothbard, take it or leave it.
It's interesting. He starts with this fairly quick treatment of the ancient Greeks, and he gets into a lot of philosophy, talks a lot about Aristotle, who was, of course, a huge influence not only on him, but also on Rand. But we think of Rothbard as coming at natural law or acquiring his view of natural law from Aquinas several centuries later. But he really gets into Aristotle's political thought here, and this tension between the political philosophy of Aristotle and Christianity itself, which would come later. But I guess the takeaway here, Patrick, is that the Greeks wanted to use reason to discover natural law. They wanted to use logic. And so that's something that distinguishes them from understanding phenomena as opposed to their predecessors.
Right. So Rothbard says, he starts off, it all began with the Greeks. Something very important in Rothbard's history of thought, as well as just his overall worldview, is this concept that you discussed called natural law, which basically refers to the fact that there's cause and effect in the world, in that humans, more importantly, have the ability to understand how the world works. So understand how the physical world works, understand how the human mind works, understand human phenomenon, and so on. And so this is a big part of natural law. The Greeks sort of considered economics, or at least what they thought of economics, as a subset of this, and that this is something that really influences a lot of people, especially this Aristotelian perspective that Rothbard references so much, obviously based off of Aristotle. The basic philosophical outlook of an Aristotelian is that we can sort of derive reason is linked with the empirical world, and we can derive reason from empirically known reality. So it's the idea that we can deduce from the self-evident empirical facts. So it's reason, but it's broadly empirical, not in the scientific sort of positivist sense, but just in the fact that, okay, we understand humans act, we understand that there's a variety of resources and so on. So this is something that's very influential, not just for later economists, but also the Austrian school more broadly.
Well, and of course, this is a big deal, right? I mean, we can imagine that most pre-Christian thought was mystical almost entirely, and people thought their lives were completely determined by gods or something. So this is a big deal.
Oh, absolutely, especially because Rothbard goes through the Aristotelian influence on the Catholic Church and Catholic scholars, particularly the Scholastics, and contrasts it with those of the Protestant Reformation, especially the Calvinists, which thought that, well, man's salvation is God's choice. It's sort of anti-natural law. It's the idea that the God decides who will be saved and who won't. Man is sort of inherently sinful. It's a much different perspective on the world that not only influences religious outlook, but even economic outlook.
When you say he doesn't pull punches, what do you think of this attack on Plato? He likes Aristotle, Plato not so much. And he even titles a little section called Plato's Right-Wing Collectivist Utopia, referring to the Republic.
Yeah, it's an interesting, because I've read the Republic, and it's of course always fascinating when you read Rothbard's perspective on a great work, so to speak, like in terms of a classic, like a true classic that is taught across many disciplines. I think his perspective on Plato's The Republic is sort of spot on, in that Plato divides the world between the philosopher kings, the guardians, and I want to say the producers. It really is sort of a communism for elites. In that sense of the right-wing collectivist utopia, sort of dismissive of private property and so on. Though I do believe he praises Plato, and this is a very important part, because Plato did base the division of labor on innate inequalities between people. Mm-hmm. So while it wasn't that his perspective is that, someone's born a king, then they're going to die a king, or someone's born a blacksmith and so on. As economists, we wouldn't go that far, but we would go farther than other economists. As Austrians, we say that the division of labor is based on the fact that we have different skills, and our comparative advantages will come from those innate inequalities amongst people.
Well, and you bring up his acute awareness of later divisions between Protestants and Catholics, for example. And this is something, Rothbard, the revisionist, he always seems to understand religion better than not only most historians, but far better than most economists. So as he segues into this section on the Christian Middle Ages, let's say up into the Renaissance, it's really interesting to me how he's able to weave in Aquinas and Roman Catholicism and the Protestant Reformation, and really look at this in terms of all kinds of economic phenomena like price and just price, and whether being a merchant was sinful. This is actually really interesting stuff to a non-economist like me. This is not a book that is dry or tedious.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because a lot of the former economic debates in many ways are just kind of recycled. It might not be the exact same thing, but it's always a variation on theme. So when we hear about now today, there's not necessarily a discussion of just price from a religious perspective, but people are taught, many people argue, that certain prices are unethical or there's price gouging. Merchants are taking advantage of people. Being a businessman is almost inherently sinful. Greed is bad versus working in the public sector or charity. Things like social entrepreneurship is better than just, regular profit and loss entrepreneurship or private sector entrepreneurship, kind of so on and so forth. So it's very important in that, Rothbard goes through this and discusses kind of how the earlier Italian scholastics were argued that the just price was really the market price. And this was unfortunately later superseded by other scholastics and other economists who thought that, well, the just price could also be what the government says it is. And this also led to later confusions regarding usury. So is lending money at interest inherently problematic? What function does interest play? This was something that the earlier economists really did struggle with, and that impacted later thought. But it's something that we even see today, because if you ask most people why interest exists, they're going to probably say something along the lines of capitalist exploitation.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. He brings up this point that there's no biblical foundation for the idea of usury being sinful. And, I've heard some different podcasts. I haven't studied this at length, but I think there's actually more nuance in the Quran as well about the status of usury and how we even define it.
Right. So I believe Rothbard says something, there's no groundwork for usury prohibitions in the natural law or in most texts in the Old and the New Testament. But it still was something that the church kind of seized on and built off of various usury restrictions. And this is a big issue because the scholastics and the earlier thinkers associated with the Catholic Church, they did struggle with this phenomenon, and they didn't fully recognize the importance of something what was later known as time preference, or even the risk associated with interest and loaning. Some of them did, but it wasn't fully systematized. But it is fascinating how Rothbard is always trying to show how the correct thought or the incorrect thought, its relationship to various religious texts.
So we should talk a little bit about Aquinas. We're in the 1200s. And of course, we all know, or I shouldn't say we all, Rothbardians know the tremendous influence of Aquinas on Rothbard's normative work, the Ethics of Liberty, for example. What is Rothbard's big takeaway from Aquinas more in the economic realm?
Sure. So Thomas Aquinas, he was around in the 1200s. Rothbard really wants to emphasize that he did have a lot of the foundational insights regarding economics. There's a lot of good insights. So Aquinas, he made the basic connection between wants and price. So this subjective value or this utility determines price, not labor or the cost of production. And that he was also very big in influencing the scholastics that the just price equals the market price. So the right price is the price that's mutually agreed upon by buyers and sellers, and that's ultimately determined by utility or happiness. It's not the equal to just price. It's not equal to cost of production or the government. Aquinas, recognized that trade was not sinful. He wasn't, perfect on that, but no one is. But he recognized a lot of the basic sort of the foundation regarding the importance of utility, the benefits of trade, and so on, that later influenced scholastics as well as the Austrian school.
There seems to be this enduring idea even today, but certainly in the Middle Ages, which Rothbard's discussing here, that for a trade or exchange to take place, there has to be this balancing act on the two sides. There has to be this equality, and that somehow we find value. And so is Aquinas getting at, in a proto manner here, the idea that, both sides think they're better off. That's why they engage in an exchange in the first place.
Yes, so I think he is grasping at that. This is something that Rothbard discusses throughout the book, this phenomenon. All right, is exchange something mutually beneficial, or is it a zero-sum game? So I think as John Buridan, about 100 years after Aquinas, was very influential in arguing that exchange was mutually beneficial, versus someone like Montaigne. I'm not saying, hopefully I think I pronounced the name right, was that exchange is sort of a zero-sum game. And that, you had this divergent sort of path. among economists, and a lot of it is based off of what determines price. Is it utility? Because if you understand that utility determines price, then you can more clearly see that exchange is mutually beneficial. People aren't going to engage in exchange unless they value what they are receiving more than what they're giving.
Yeah, and of course it's so obvious to us now, but we have the benefit of all these incredible thinkers and we have the benefit of hindsight. I thought it was interesting when he's bringing up Aristotle's example of if someone trades a house, which must have been, we have to think of what a house was in terms of that era, for a pair of shoes, then there has to be some proportional relationship between how many home builders there are and how many shoemakers. And of course, now we look back on that and we think, well, why would there be any proportion at all? But, not so simple then to conceptualize this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And so Aristotle, interestingly enough, I guess he grasped the subjective theory of value, and then sort of the Austrian law of imputation that the value of the ends determines the value of the means, and so on. But he did slip into this exchange as an equality of value. So if two people are trading for something, then that means they are both valued equally, which as Austrians we know is just simply incorrect. And this is it's a tough thing. Of course, in hindsight, we can look back at thinkers and see where they slipped up or where they made a mistake or something that's incorrect. But economic thought does not just come out of nowhere. It takes several years, if not hundreds of years, of painstakingly thinking about problems in an abstract sense in order to discover the truth.
So with Rothbard's characteristic revisionism, is Aquinas a bigger historical and philosophical figure than Aristotle or not?
I think Aquinas is that's a really good question. I think Aquinas, I would say, is bigger, at least because he's discussing more about economic concepts, and this is also he's directly influencing a lot of scholastics, which are certainly closer to major economists later on than the Greeks, which there's obviously 1,000+ years difference. So I think in terms of just the basic kind of economic thought, Aquinas was in many ways continuing the Aristotelian thought, but I would say he was a bigger person simply because of the influence.
Well, so Rothbard and other famous Austrians like Jesus Huerta de Soto, who is still very much teaching in Madrid, they've written quite a lot about the Spanish scholastics. We get into the 1500s, the School of Salamanca, and this is where Rothbard says we really got proto-Austrian. So what's the big deal about the Spanish scholastic school, and what did it mean then? What's its influence today on us?
Right. So after the earlier Italian scholastics, which is about in, let's just say, the 1200s, 1300s, in the late 1400s, you really started to see, just from a broader historical perspective, the rise of Spain as a superpower and the relative decline of the Italian city-states. So Spain really became the center of scholastic thought in the 1500s, and this is so they're the center of economic thought, which makes sense because they're the leading superpower. In the Spanish scholastics, the School of Salamanca, as you've mentioned, were very influential in influencing other Austrians. One, they continue to recognize that subjective value is the utility is the determinant of price. They had grasped at the fact that it was marginal utility. They couldn't necessarily articulate it in as correct of a fashion as we would like. So there was still this vexing problem of the diamond water paradox, which we could talk about. Is that how is water, which is so much more useful than diamonds, priced lower? Well, it must be due to cost of labor or something like that. In reality, it's the marginal utility. We have so much water; it's a much greater stock of water than there is of diamonds. So the scholastics continued to advance the subjective value tradition. They had also looked at money. So they were influential in just even working out just like a simple quantity theory of money, which is that if you increase the money supply, prices will rise, which is something that is still might be seen as a little controversial in modern politics, or at least when people are trying to describe what's the reason for the rise in prices in 2021. But again, the Scholastics, they had discussed monetary analysis showing how increasing the money supply leads to higher prices. They had, as Huerta de Soto has also elaborated on, in addition to Rothbard, written a lot about banking, particularly fractional reserve banking. They'd spoken about the benefits of private property rights and anti-absolutism, or anti sort of the power of kings. So they had a lot of foundational insights regarding subjective value, regarding the importance of the free market and voluntary exchange, and just basic monetary economics.
So what should we know about Wanda Mariana? We had some Dominicans in our conversation so far, but now we've got a Jesuit, and he is among, as you just mentioned, someone who's talking about inflationism, for example, and he's got interesting things to say about rulers. Rulers should fear us, and the idea that tyrannicide is an extant possibility in any society is a salutary thing.
Right. So we think about the perspective of Wanda Mariana, so this is the age of absolutism, right? So the king is just the ruler. You have to listen to what the king says, is related to the divine right of kings. The king has a mandate from God. The king is literally a representative of God. You must fight for the king. You must pay your taxes to the king. You must die for the king, etc. So someone challenging this is very provocative, saying that you have the right to resist the king, or the right to rebel the king. This is a forerunner to John Locke's sort of social contract theory, etc. He was also very, as you've mentioned, I think the work was the alteration of money, something like that, in the early 1600s. He was very anti-government debasement. So he really hit on this point, this theme that Austrians would later pick up, that inflation is a tax. So it redistributes money from the late receivers to the early receivers, aka the government, in that actually criticized using price controls to stop inflation, right? So saying no, the problem is increasing the money supply, which is done so to finance various government deficits, right? So monetizing the debt. So he was very anti-government intervention, and this, of course, earned him the ire of the Spanish monarch, Philip III, because clearly he doesn't want this guy writing all of this stuff saying government policies are not working. So a lot of, again, very foundational stuff just regarding the efficiency of a market versus government intervention. So it's very important information.
Well, I think he also gets thrown in jail for it, for the act of lèse majesté, right? For criticizing the Spanish king.
Yeah, he was. I believe they asked him to shut up, and I think he eventually got he got the message. And this is something that it's very important that Rothbard mentions, not only regarding the Scholastics but even later thinkers, is that the writing controversial ideas or even free market ideas, it was not just as bad as you would get blocked on Twitter, or you wouldn't get a job. You might lose your head, so to speak, when you are criticizing the government, challenging the king's law, the king's intervention, etc. You could be put on the chopping block.
And as you mentioned, a lot of his thought was influenced by absolutism. We're in this period where we're getting into the 15th and then the 16th through 18th century, where Spain, France, England all have absolute monarchs. You have the lesson of King Henry VIII, and then, of course, Louis XIV would maybe represent the high point of this period. So in a sense, Wanda Mariana is presaging the mercantilism of the next couple of centuries. And what I really liked was Rothbard's explication of this. I mean, I think of mercantilism as a cousin of fascism, everything within the state. But the idea that absolute rulers need a bureaucracy to enable them to impose this rule, I thought was not a way I had ever thought of mercantilism before.
Yeah, it's a great point, because Rothbard not only is concentrating on the kings, the rulers, the absolutist rulers, etc., but also the bureaucrats, the politicians, and the intellectuals who are justifying. So if you have absolutism, you also need to have mercantilists. And this sort of mercantilism is something that is not always described in as clear of a fashion as Rothbard mentions. Or Rothbard just describes it as it's just special interest privileges to favored business elites to strengthen the nation at the expense of other nation states, right? That's what mercantilism is. Some other people say, well, it's more complex or balance of trade. They downplay the privileges, probably because they recognize that a lot of current interventionist economic thought is based off of mercantilism. I don't think it's a coincidence that Keynes heavily criticized classical economists, but he did always have some positive things to say about some earlier economic cranks and mercantilist thinkers. So the Rothbard's discussion of mercantilism is very interesting.
Do you think that it's largely still with us? Do you think that's the system under which we operate today? We think of the managerial state or the deep state. Or do you think the 20th century really represents at least a pretty significant victory for relatively free global trade?
It's a great question. I think ultimately we still live under the same system, though the one difference is that we have more countries participating in the worldwide division of labor. Even in the 1700s and the 1800s, sort of we want to think of the high point of laissez-faire in Great Britain and the United States. I mean, most other countries in the world had not really embarked upon entering worldwide trade or their own industrial revolutions, et cetera. But so now we see more countries to be much more interventionist than we used to be in the 1800s, but that's kind of participating with each other. Though very recently, we have seen a move away from globalization and free trade, et cetera, even just paying lip service to those ideas with COVID and the lockdowns as we move back almost into economic blocks. China wants to do its own thing in Asia. The EU wants to do its own thing in Europe. We want to do our own thing in North America, et cetera. And that's definitely problematic, not just for living standards, but also just for personal freedom and the development of economic thought.
Well, it's interesting, Patrick, when you read Liberalism or Nation, State, and Economy from Mises, he's writing those in the interwar years, or early part of the 20th century. He's looking back at the 18 and 1700s. And when he says laissez-faire, he's talking about a domestic policy. We need laissez-faire at home and then free trade abroad to prevent autarky, for example. So I think when you and I, who had the benefit of living in the 20th and 21st century, when we think of laissez-faire, we think of that as more a holistic policy. But it was a domestic policy in Mises's thinking.
So Mises does speak about it in terms of domestic terms. Even in many American economists, it's sort of been broadened more and more to include international relations, kind of linked in with non-interventionism, or what's sort of deridingly referred to as isolationism, et cetera. And of course, when we're on the topic of laissez-faire, we got to talk about the famous French laissez-faire thinkers. It's an interesting sort of anecdote. Rothbard mentions how the term laissez-faire came to be when the famous mercantilist Jean-Baptiste Colbert sort of asked the French businessman what the French government should do to stimulate the economy. Thomas Legendre, I think, basically said laissez-non-faire, which is leave it to us, right? And it's this idea of laissez-faire is no economist can ever say they're in favor of laissez-faire, because if you say you're in favor of laissez-faire, then you say you're in favor of decreased government involvement in the economy. If you're in favor of decreased government involvement in the economy, well, then you're going to be out of a job as an economist.
Well, so let's get into that. Let's get into some of the French thinkers. And why don't we start with Cantillon, who's obviously of French heritage. He's got a French name, but because of dispossession, his family ends up living in Ireland. And most people think of Adam Smith as the founder of what we would call modern economics. Rothbard disagrees. He says it's Richard Cantillon. Mark Thornton's written quite a bit about him. We know the Cantillon effect with respect to the non-neutrality of money. I mean, he's a big figure, a big thinker, also a fascinating guy, a guy who became very wealthy in his life, who was apparently murdered. I mean, there's a lot going on here, and Rothbard really likes him.
Right. So when we get to Cantillon, he's the first thinker. F.A. Hayek argued that his book, An Essay on the Nature of Trade in general, which was written in the 1730s, but it was only published after Cantillon's death in 1755. Hayek believed it constituted the first economics treatise, and it also moved beyond just what the Scholastics and the Mercantilists wrote about, because he abstracted from things like public policy and ethics. This is really, okay, let me analyze economic theory. And in many ways, it is the first treatise, because even though it's relatively short, it does cover a lot of these important topics from the bottom up, sort of building each step of the way, getting a little more complicated, adding additional layer to the edifice. So, Cantillon was very influential, especially for the Austrians, because he once again focused on the scholastic tradition of looking at exchange from the perspective of utility determining price. This led him to focus on real world pricing. So focusing on the pricing of goods determined in the short run after production has already occurred. Cantillon is analyzing the entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur as an uncertainty bearer in their job in forecasting consumer demands and allocating resources. This is very big for the later Austrian theories. Cantillon was big, as you mentioned, with regard to monetary analysis. So this Cantillon effect, in many ways, is superior to later economists' views on the monetary transmission mechanism. So Cantillon showing that every change in spending impacts relative prices at different times and in unequal fashion. This is something it's really, really important. And it's all the more incredible that he wrote it as sort of a side job, and it wasn't even published after he wrote his book. The essay wasn't even published after he died.
Well, his side job indeed, because he's busy getting rich off this unholy land deal, which Rothbard describes the Mississippi Company, where he basically shorted what he thought was a bubble and became very wealthy as a result. And he's doing all this in France, by the way. He leaves Ireland for Paris. So why is it the treatise? Is that what makes him the founding father of modern economics, or was it something more than that? Was it his overall contribution, his holistic contribution? Because that's pretty high praise.
Right. It's of course I would say both, because I guess what good is a treatise if it's incorrect? And on the other hand, if you're making a lot of foundational contributions, then you probably have to write at least a sort of a systematic work on economics. This is admittedly different than Turgot, who did not write a treatise or really a systematic work. It was mainly sort of fragments and different essays. But I would say it's Cantillon's thought. He's continuing the scholastic tradition. So Cantillon, again, the subjective theory of value, real world pricing, entrepreneurship, the harmful effects of government intervention. Cantillon wasn't perfect in that. He slipped into some mercantilist fallacies, but then again, no one is. His analysis of money, again, building off of the scholastic recognition that changes in the money supply change prices and production and so on. And so I would put him in that position, that when you think about the first thinker, you really want to spend a lot of time analyzing. They make a lot of contributions themselves. I would say Cantillon would be the first one. The Scholastics, there's a lot of Scholastics. Cantillon, there's only one Cantillon.
So who should claim him? Is he a French economist? Is he an Irish economist?
Well, as someone who's part Irish, I would say the Irish should claim him. I mean, my name is Patrick, but I'm sure that's probably not the most objective opinion. I would definitely say he's more French than someone who's from the British Isles, in that his economic thought was influenced by the continental economists. So earlier French Laissez Faire thinkers, Italian scholastics, Spanish scholastics, etc. I would put him in the continental tradition rather than the tradition of the British Isles or the English tradition.
Okay. So that moves us into the French physiocrats, and also Turgot, who Rothbard takes pains to say, no, was misidentified perhaps as a physiocrat. So what's happening in France in the 1800s. There's so much, not only in France, but in the U.S. You have, Adam Smith is coming up soon as well. So what's a physiocrat? What's with this obsession with agricultural production, and why is this noteworthy for us?
Sure. So in the 1700s, just going through some basic political and historical information. So certain countries are taking off relative to other countries. So Spain has been eclipsed. Spain was 1500s, I guess, and it's basically focusing on Great Britain and France, and then later the American colonies and what became the United States. Great Britain is really taking the lead in terms of its governmental system after the Glorious Revolution, as at least a constitutional monarchy. Not perfect, but that is very important. In contrast to France, which stuck with its absolutist monarchy. Great Britain was winning the colonial battles, so it became the world superpower after the French and Indian War of the 1750s and early 1760s. So you've got a lot of people in France. They're recognizing that, hey, wait a second, Great Britain, its colonies are growing so much because of salutary neglect. Its government seems to be working more efficiently because it's more limited. Hey, this laissez faire, this free market ideas, these concepts, they work. We should practice them. The issue, though, of course, is that you have an absolutist monarchy, and the King of France isn't exactly going to be okay with that. So this leads to the physiocrats, who are really trying to push for laissez faire. Their strategy was, well, you just convert the king. If you teach the king a bunch of free market economics, then the king will embrace it. Unfortunately, they didn't realize that aside from incentive issues, you're putting all of your eggs in one basket. So what happens if the king or the king's heir, corks off, if he dies, then, you did all that hard work for nothing. So that's the flaw in the physiocrat strategy. But the physiocrats' actual sort of economics was very based off of that land or agricultural is the source of wealth. So this led them to really focus on the land, which became a flaw in their reasoning. They were very anti-tax or trying to lower taxes, but they also advocated that, and sort of a predecessor of Henry George in the mid to late 1800s, that we can just replace it with a single tax on land. This is all based around the idea that, you've got the landlord, the owner of the land, and he just sits there. So he's just collecting unnecessary income, rent. Right. This is what was later the classical economists referred to as rent. They didn't realize that the landlord actually performed a very important function. There was a lot of work and entrepreneurial insight that came into forecasting the relative values of land and deciding what you should build on a certain place. If you should not build something for now, to save it for something in the future, et cetera. But this is that was sort of their overall perspective on land, and it unfortunately hindered more than it helped them.
But shouldn't we cut them a little slack here? You call it a blind spot, viewing land as the basis for all economic. I mean, we haven't yet gotten to the Industrial Revolution. We're really at the height of agrarian Europe, and so we could understand why they thought that wealth or economics should be analyzed around land. And also, aren't they really the first true economic liberals, people who were championing that movement away from monarchs and mercantilism towards what we would today call economic liberalism?
So in the modern sense, building off of the Scholastics, the Physiocrats, they were some of these first big thinkers in terms of laissez faire. So that should be they should be praised for that. In the land, I guess I didn't mean to necessarily criticize them on their focus of land per se, in that, it was the pre-industrial revolution. Most work was done. People worked on farms. They didn't work in factories, at least the large majority of them. Really, some of their perceptions and what later influenced the classical economists argued regarding land, because many of them were starting to write around this time period, and even in the early 1800s, when most of the world was still agricultural, that landlords and land was just sort of seen as an unnecessary component. It was just an unnecessary income, rent, in that the landlords just sat there, and that, well, we can just basically put all the taxes on land.
Well, but I'm interested by their attempt at understanding or explaining how countries get rich. I mean, you point out that Spain was receding in power and wealth and influence at this point. England and France were rising. And when we look at that, I think even today we have the benefit of 300 years since then, let's say. I don't think we still really get it. I don't think we still understand. You have books, you have Deirdre McCloskey writing. You have books like, if you recall, I'm sure some of our listeners know, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which was from the 90s by Jared Diamond. We still have all these theories for the rise and fall of countries or nations, but I think Rothbard and the Physiocrats here are giving us an understanding which is unappreciated or underappreciated, that we still don't fully understand, and we ought to understand as technology progresses, our understanding should progress. We still don't fully get why some countries are rich and some countries are poor, and that seems to me a hell of an important thing to understand.
Yeah, that is true. The reasons for economic growth. I mean, most economists would, at least the good ones, would argue that institutions are the reason for economic growth, and really the free market. So not having the government do anything. I know it's not the focus of our talk. This is the main focus of Adam Smith's An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Smith, in some lectures earlier on, said it's peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, which is pretty right.
Yeah,
it's more or less just don't get in wars, have a good legal system, and don't overly regulate or tax businesses. And this is something that it makes so much economic sense, but economists today, as well as other thinkers, of course, they don't want to argue for that perspective because, again, the free market is not the most lucrative area for employment in power for economists. So the real reasons for economic development have to be something else, or the reason the Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain was the Black Death, or was it a change in the ratio between capital and labor, or it was some government assistance somewhere else, et cetera. Again, it all circles back to the eternal struggle, really, between people who advocate the free market versus people who justify increased government intervention.
So when we're talking about these French thinkers of the 18th century, what's important about Turgot? Why does he stand out? Why does Rothbard praise him?
So Turgot was a very important French thinker. He was one of those Laissez Faire reformers. I believe he was Minister of Finance in France in the mid-1770s. So he was trying to engage in some reforms. Didn't really work. He didn't write that much in economics, but what he wrote was very good. And this is something that's important. We wish he wrote more. He again spoke very good on laissez faire, free trade, so not having a government subsidize another industry, or to try and lower tariffs, particularly tariffs on bread and foreign grains. So Turgot, once again emphasized the importance of market exchange and so on. He also continued to emphasize the importance of subjective utility and value, sort of touched on opportunity cost. He anticipated the opportunity cost doctrine, though it wasn't perfect. I think his major advancements that separate him from guys like Cantillon and other thinkers was really when it came in what he wrote about regarding time preference in the capital structure. So really a major developer of the Austrian structure of production approach. He emphasized the importance of time. If Cantillon emphasized the entrepreneur, then Turgot emphasized the capitalist, or really what Bombeverk later called the capitalist entrepreneur. So recognizing that interest is related to time preference, that savings influence the interest rate, that savings develop the structure of production. Turgot really touched on all of these concepts that play such an important role in the Austrian edifice.
And of course, subjectivism and marginalism helps us understand value. It helps us understand price formation. But was Turgot ahead of his time in helping us understand price formation without this equilibrium BS?
He does have the basic sort of utility analysis and sort of real world pricing. So I believe it was in in value and money. That was one of his essays. I've got the Mises Institute books. This would be a good plug to know the Mises Institute published a collection of Turgot writings, as well as Cantillon's essay. Turgot analyzed bilateral exchange. He showed the mutual benefit, how people benefit from an exchange and all of that. Turgot, also really touched on what was known as the law of diminishing returns, so that all else equal, there's an optimal amount of the varying factor. If you keep a plant in a certain amount of soil in a pot, then if you don't add enough water, it's not going to grow. If you add too much water, it's going to drown. It won't grow. So there's an optimal. This was something that really wasn't rediscovered for many more years. So Turgot's got a lot of great insights.
Well, this has been fascinating for me to go through this book, and especially to avail myself economic historians like yourself. I want to encourage people to check it out. We'll link to a free PDF of the book. Next week, we're going to have a couple special guests. Not Patrick. I'm going to let him off the hook, let him get back to his day job. But we're going to really spend an entire show on this period of the Scottish Enlightenment, and especially Adam Smith and Hume. And the Wealth of Nations, and we'll probably talk about Mill and Bentham as well in that conversation. So it's a really meaty part of Rothbard's analysis, and we're going to give it some good time next week. But in the meantime, as I mentioned, Patrick, a fellow here at the Mises Institute, is an economic historian in his own right. His new book is out. It's available in hardcover. It's called Cronyism. You can find it at Mises.org. You can also find it at our upcoming event in Florida in October, our Supporter Summit event, where Patrick, we're going to roll it out. We're going to have a gala evening, sort of a book launch, and I'm sure Patrick's going to be signing so many of those. His hand is going to be sore. So check it out at Mises.org. Check out the show notes for a link to Rothbard's 2-volume book, and be sure to join us next week for a thoroughgoing look at Adam Smith. So all that said, Patrick, I want to thank you for your time, and ladies and gentlemen, have a great weekend.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm glad to be on the podcast again.
The Human Action Podcast is available on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, and on Mises.org. Subscribe to get new episodes every week, and find more content like this on Mises.org.